I think it's great that everybody's gotten a break from me today. I wish that you got a complete break, but I want you to let us know what you think about this format. If you enjoy having everybody sum it up, because if so, it would be great, I think, to end every sermon series that way. Jay and Mark and Nathan probably won't enjoy that, but I think it's great to have that break from just me. You know, the older I get, the more I realize how little I know. Or at least the more I realize that I know less than I thought that I knew. And it's the same when it comes to studying, because the more I study the scripture, the more I realize how little I know and how often what I think I know is probably wrong. And so my lesson today is very simple because that's what I need. I need to be reminded, not just about the fundamentals of faith, but I need to be reminded that sometimes it's even simpler, more simple, than the fundamentals of faith. Sometimes it is just deciding to surrender. Adrian Rogers tells a story about about a conversation he had with a man from Romania. His name was Joseph Son. They were talking about the difference between commitment and surrender. Son said this. He said, when you make a commitment, you are still in control, no matter how noble the thing that you commit to is. He says you can commit to pray, to study the Bible, to give money, to make an automobile payment, or to lose weight. But whatever you choose to do, you were still in control of it. But surrender is different. If someone holds a gun to you and tells you to lift your hands and surrender, do you tell them what you're committed to? No. You lift your hands and surrender, and you do exactly what they tell you to do. The key word is to surrender, to give up control to someone else. And we often, I think, confuse commitment and surrender. Commitment says, I'm going to do this. Surrender says, God, I will do whatever you want me to do. Jay used a great verse toward the end of his lesson, where he said that we are slaves to righteousness. And that's really what it's about. Quite often we talk about serving God, but really we are slaves. The Bible uses the term bondservant over and over again. Certainly we need commitment in the church today, but more than that, we need surrender. We need to be willing to completely surrender our lives to Christ. When I started reflecting on the foundations of faith, when I started reflecting on the lessons that we've been talking about for the last couple of months, one thing kept coming to my mind. Surrender. I know the foundations of faith are easy, but yet often they're difficult, aren't they? It's not because they're difficult to follow. It's not because I don't understand or we don't understand what God is asking. It's because quite often we have an image of what we want to do. And that gets in the way of what God asks us to do. Now you think about people, sometimes it's hard when you have a job, isn't it? And your boss tells you to do something and you know there's a lot better way to do it. And you say, I can do it faster this way. And he says, I want to, or she says, I want it done this way. What do you say? Okay. And you do it, right? But because we don't have God looking down, writing us up when we do something wrong, we often say, God, I know you want it done this way, but my way is way better. But being reminded of the fundamentals pushes me toward understanding that I cannot do it on my own. That I'll never be good enough, I'll never be righteous enough, and no matter how hard I try, I'm just not going to be good at it. The only way is to surrender to God, and that is not easy. We all know what surrender looks like, and I think that's part of what makes surrender so difficult and so hard to do. There's a great story that I think illustrates what complete surrender is all about. It's found in Mark chapter 1. When he had gone a little further from there, he saw James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, who also were in the boat mending their nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and went after him. Jesus called James and John, and they immediately submitted their lives to him. They left Dad behind in the boat with the servants. They left their home, they left their families, they left their jobs. They left everything that they knew behind to submit to Christ and to follow him. When Jesus calls our name today, the only answer, at least the only answer that he wants, is surrender. We are to live a life of complete surrender. When we look at the lives of many Bible people, we see people like James and John and Peter and Andrew and Matthew and so many others. When Jesus called, they followed. And they didn't follow for a while and then go back. They followed until most of them were killed because of their belief. Today, talk is cheap. We can talk about temptation to God. We can talk about complete surrender. We can talk about being radically separated. But the proof is not in what we say. The proof is in what we're doing. If that talk does not lead us to serve God, if it doesn't lead us to dedicate our lives to him, then it's not real. And Satan is really, really good today. Satan is great at making us think that we have surrendered our lives to him, when in fact we have not. Maybe we have surrendered one small part of our life to him, but our brain says, way to go. You have done a great job surrendering. But maybe I've only surrendered one tiny little part. But Satan is there. Satan is pushing, saying, good job. Go, you go. And I don't know about you, but I'm really good at that. My brain is really good at tricking myself into thinking that I'm doing the right thing or making the right decisions. I've used this illustration before because it's kind of dumb, and those of you who are younger probably don't even know what a Yugo is, but it's perhaps the most horrible card that has ever been produced. But my brain is messed up enough that I could tell myself that I needed a Yugo, and I could convince myself that it was the perfect car for me because it gets great gas mileage. It's really light and maneuverable, right? It's cute in a really ugly way. I mean, you can just trick yourself into believing it. Satan does the same thing in our lives. When we say, I have committed to surrender to Jesus in one area of my life. Unfortunately, today, when we talk about surrender, it seems like a dirty word. When we think of surrender, we usually think of surrendering during wartime. Maybe we think of Japan in World War II. Or maybe more recently, we think of Saddam Hussein when he was found in his hole in the ground, all dirty and disgusting. When we talk about surrender, we have someone winning and someone losing. And so the concept of surrendering our lives to Christ is not an appealing one. Because we have to say, okay, God, you win and I lose. But surrender in Scripture is something that's different than that. By surrendering to Christ, it means victory for us and victory for Christ. Not like surrender in the world. Notice what Galatians 2 says. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. When we surrender, we allow Christ to live in us. We allow him to make the decisions for us. We trust him enough to subordinate our desires to his. We trust him enough to allow him to make the decisions. Bruce Larson tells how he helped people who were struggling with surrender to give their lives over to Christ. He writes this. He says, for many years, I worked in New York City, and I counseled at my office any number of people who were really wrestling with a yes or no decision. I would often suggest they walk with me from my office down to the RCA building on Fifth Avenue. In the entrance of that building is a gigantic statue of Atlas, a beautifully proportioned man with all of his muscles straining. Now notice those were his words. I would not say a beautifully proportioned man. That just doesn't sound right. But that's what he said. And he said he's holding the world and he can barely stand up under this burden. And he said, now I would point out to them that this is certainly one way to live, trying to carry the world on your shoulders. But then he would say, now come with me. And he walked across the street. On the other side of Fifth Avenue is St. Patrick's Cathedral. And there behind the high altar on the shrine is a statue of the boy Jesus. perhaps 8 or 9 years old, and with no effort at all, he is holding the world in his hand. And he said, my point was illustrated graphically. We have a choice. We can carry the world on our shoulders, or we can say, God, I give my world to you. Here's my life. Here is everything. And so our question today is a simple one. Are you ready to surrender? Because we know surrender is not easy. Surrender takes faith. I read something one time that I really liked, and it said sometimes we have to jump off the cliff and build our wings on the way down. And I think that is what surrender is. Surrender is God saying, do this, and it will be okay. And we take the chance not knowing for sure. Surrender is something that I've struggled with all of my life. It's something that I know I will continue to struggle with. But I also know that it's worth it. And so the question today is, are you ready? Are you willing to surrender? We never want to close without offering them the invitation today. You've heard lots of things to think about today. You've heard about continuing the cycle and bringing it to the next generation from Nathan. You've heard Mark remind us that we need to own it and that we have a lot of motivation today to take ownership. And we heard from Jay about the encouragement of having structure. Are you ready today to own your salvation? Are you ready today to make the decisions that you need to? If you've never given your life over to Christ, we invite you to do that. Or if you have, but you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters, please come forward as we stand and sing.